Hey, what's up guys? It's Reflex, and in today's video I want to go over the basics of nib tuning or troubleshooting if your nib isn't quite writing the way you expect it to. And I want to preface this video by saying I'm not responsible for anything that happens if you do try to follow any of this. I am by no means a professional nib meister or anything. Everything I know about nib tuning I have researched and tried myself on nibs that I didn't mind ruining. And yeah, I just want to specify that if you do anything I say, do it at your own risk. And if you are wanting to try tuning a nib by yourself and kind of learning that as well, I recommend trying with a nib that you don't mind breaking. So if you have a broken fountain pen or a cheap fountain pen you don't mind breaking, that works perfectly. This is a relatively expensive nib, about $30 or $40 generally, I think. However, it is broken. It doesn't look broken, but it's broken. There's no fixing it. So I will be demonstrating with it. And yeah, let's get into it. So to do the basics of nib tuning, you don't really need anything special. You just need the pen itself and maybe a notebook. However, a loop majorly helps. This allows you to get a really good magnification into the nib. Let me go ahead and see if you can see it on camera. I don't know if you will. Yeah, too much reflections, but I think you kind of get the idea. It allows you to get a really close-up view of the nib, which can be incredibly helpful. You can get these pretty cheap. One comes along with Goulet's nib tuning kit, which is how I got this one. But before this, what I would use is this cheap little bag of lenses that you can clip to your phone. I got this one, oh boy, 7 years ago, probably. And it has this little lens that you clip onto your phone, and it includes a macro lens, which has been incredibly helpful. That's what I've always used. But then I wanted the nib tuning kit from Goulet to get some of the other stuff, and came with this, so why not? So again, not necessary, but it helps immensely. So if you plan on working on a lot of nibs or something like that, I recommend picking up a loop for sure. So the first common problem that I see a lot is your pen being scratchy when you write. Now, scratchy and feedback are two separate things. Feedback can be desirable to some people. Scratchiness is not desirable by anyone. It's when you're writing and it's like just scratching the paper. Feedback is more like writing with a pencil, where you get that feedback. It's not just like smooth, buttery writing. You don't want scratchiness. So if your pen is scratchy, what you want to do is check to make sure your tines are aligned. Your tines are the two separate parts. You see that split? You have the little breather hole, and then you have that split. It's kind of hard to see with this nib. There you go. You see that split right there? The two sides of it are the tines. And now if your tines are not aligned, this is very difficult to do on video. That right there is the tip. And so if your tines are not aligned, one side may be higher than the other. And so what happens if your tines are not aligned and one's higher than the other, then when you're writing, one tine is going to be scratching the paper. It's going to be getting caught on the paper and scratching it up, which you obviously don't want. So how do you fix that? Pretty simple, but again, you will need to be careful, because if you're not careful trying to fix a nib, you can easily destroy it beyond repair. Well, at least repair it by yourself. Even then, sometimes a nib meister might not be able to fix it, depending on how bad you mess up. So try not to mess up if you do this, of course. So what you want to do is place your finger at the top of the nib. This is the same if your nib is inside of your pen. Just keep that in mind. And what you want to do is, I recommend doing it on a notebook. You can just do it directly on your desk, but I always do it on a notebook just so it's a little softer. I don't know if it makes that big of a difference, but that's what I do. And then you'll want to just kind of push down just a little bit and rock it back and forth. Do that side to side for about 5 to 10 seconds. Check your tines, see if they're aligned. If not, keep doing that. Now, what I do if it's really bad, again, don't do this, but if you're really desperate and this is just not doing it, what you can do is, if you have fingernails, you can just kind of pry. Let me focus. You can just kind of pry it up a little bit. That is incredibly dangerous because you can very easily go too far with it. So I do not recommend doing this unless you're absolutely desperate, which I have been with some nibs, which is what has led me to do this. We don't even need to talk about how I got this out of the pen. And then once it's all aligned, it shouldn't be scratchy anymore, and it should write smooth as butter. And then if doing that makes your nib like bent up, this part of it, if that's bent up a little bit too much, which honestly that one could probably go down a little further, you can turn it upside down and do the same thing gently. Again, I can't stress how gently you need to do everything with a nib. They can be pretty fragile and you don't want to break it. And of course, if they're properly aligned and they're still scratchy and just not writing good, contact whoever you bought the pen from and see if you can get a return or a replacement or some kind of fix. And if it's a used pen, maybe contact the person you got it from, see what you can do. Or if you're able to buy a replacement nib, that's what I ended up doing for the pen this came out of, which I have a video on that as well. Now, this is also the same steps I use if I have a nib that's too dry, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Next is nib polishing. So if like that scratchy feeling might actually be too much feedback in your opinion, if you're new to fountain pens, you may just not like a high amount of feedback. A high amount of feedback will feel like writing with a pencil, absolutely. My Kaweco Perkeo, it feels like writing with a pencil. I absolutely hate it. I am on team smooth as butter, so I don't like that. And if you're new to fountain pens, you might not like feedback as well. So what you can do to smooth or polish your nib is you can get some micro mesh or even like brown paper bags and just do figure eights. I guess we just got mail. You can try that, do it for about 30 seconds, test it, another 30 seconds if you need to, so on. That might help. I've never done that, but apparently it can help. I am reading all of these steps off of a step-by-step guide from JetPens, and I actually used this when I was first learning myself, so I highly recommend it. If your nib is dry, I do kind of the same steps as if the nib is misaligned. But the thing is, when the tines are misaligned, then what you're doing is you're rocking it back and forth. So hopefully the misaligned one will go where it's supposed to. But when your nib is dry, typically the tines are too close together, so the ink is having trouble getting through the channel. It typically goes through that split. But if it's too close, you're not getting enough ink, and it feels dry when you write with it. So what I do is, I do finger in the same place, put pressure on it till you see those tines split apart. I'll put a video closer up on the screen. And I hold it there for about 10 seconds. Try to write with it, see if it's feeling wetter. And then just keep doing that. Now that might take a while, so what I sometimes do is spread the tines a little further maybe than I should, or hold it there for longer. But again, I cannot stress how careful you need to be with this, because if you spread them out too far, it's very difficult to get them back. I would say that's a lot more difficult to do than to get them spread apart. Haha. So just be really careful with this. I recommend doing it little by little. Once you're used to doing this, because I've had to do this with a lot of my nibs, especially Moon Man ones, they come pretty close together and dry. So once you're used to doing this, then I recommend, then you can kind of see, you can push the limits a little bit when you're more comfortable and you understand nibs a lot better. But if this is your first time trying something like this, just spread it out a little bit, hold it for 10 seconds, and keep doing that until it's writing good. And how do you know if your pen's dry? Typically it'll look watery or very diluted. So if you have like a nice deep blue ink and when you're writing with it, it looks light or I guess dry or just kind of watered down, then that means your pen is dry. If it's too wet, then when you're writing, it's just too much ink is coming out and it's just messy and just pooling everywhere. That's too wet. Or honestly, even what I would call perfect to me might be too wet to some people, so you might want to dry it down just so you have a little less ink coming out, which can be beneficial if you're doing stuff like school notes and you want it to dry as fast as possible. You might tune the nib to be a little drier. There's only so much you can really do yourself tuning it drier or wetter. You typically want to go with a pen or a manufacturer that is already drier or wetter to your preferences, and then you can kind of fine tune it to your liking. So you should be able to see light through that whole slit. And now you can see with this, I can't. That's because I tuned this to be drier, because this is a very wet nib. If you know anything about Pelicans, they're pretty wet, juicy. They got thick lines. This is an extra fine. It writes like a fine, maybe even a medium. That's how Pelicans are going to be. So that's why I tuned it to be a little drier. This is my first Pelican. I wasn't really expecting it, the whole thing, but yeah. So that's tuned to be a lot drier. Now if your tines are splayed, these are your tines, and they're splayed, then if you got a big gap, it's going to be too wet or possibly not even right at all if it's really splayed. So what you'll want to do if the tines are splayed too far, you'll want to roll it this way and then put pressure on the sides. Try to push them back together and then see if they are better now. Of course, if you look at mine, you can see mine are very close. Again, because it's tuned to be drier. Now, another problem you could be having if you think your pen is dry or if it's like really skipping a lot, then you might have baby's bottom. I'll throw up a picture again from the Jet Pens guide. Baby's bottom is really unfortunate. You can't really fix it. I mean, you can, but this is probably one of the most advanced things on this list. So I wouldn't recommend trying this yourself. If you get a nib with baby's bottom from a new pen, contact the manufacturer and get a return, refund, whatever you need, because that's not really going to be fixable. You could also send it to a Nibmeister. They should be able to fix it. Or you can buy a replacement nib if your pen supports easily replaceable nibs. So yeah, don't recommend using or trying to fix baby's bottom. You can try, what Jet Pen says, you can try writing with more pressure, but with fountain pens you typically don't want to use pressure. You want to use as minimal pressure preferably none as possible. You can also try using a more absorbent paper, so one that's not like super smooth feeling with a coating. You'd want to use probably like cheaper paper that feels more absorbent. And then you can also try using a wetter ink, because it'll just kind of pull on the nib and that baby's bottom will be less of a problem. And if doing all these things that can fix a dry nib it's still just feeling too dry to you, you can try a wetter ink or writing in a hotter place. And if you live somewhere cold, you could try going somewhere warmer. That might make it better, because usually the ink will kind of feel a little bit wetter as it heats up. And so that moves on to what if my ink is, or what if my nib is writing too wet? You can try a drier ink. I think Goulet is pretty good for kind of giving you a gauge of how dry or wet inks are. Based on the reviews, you can see what everyone says if it's on the drier or wetter side. What I found is that all the inks are typically rated like from the middle of the gauge to the highest, because I guess, you know, a lot of people, when you're rating inks, you're like, it's a liquid, so it's not gonna be dry. So what I would do is, if you're looking at an ink and the dry scale is closer to the middle, I would call that a dry ink. You know, it's kind of funky, but you get used to it. You can also check for an air leak, so make sure your converter or cartridge is plugged all the way into your feed. You can tighten the tines, which is, I went over that before, fixing splayed tines, or you can try, drier ink. So that's all there is to it. If you guys have any questions, do please let me know, and I'll answer them as soon as possible. Thanks for watching.